the second to last sermon in our summer series, and we have been building a table, both a physical table that you've seen each week on the video screens, and actually next week, as we close out this service, Chris Greer is going to be with us, and we're going to be having communion on that table that has been built. But in addition to that, the table's also been kind of a metaphor as a place where God's hospitality is extended inward toward his family and outward as he sends his family out into the world. Gathering for a meal is a place where hospitality is on full display. And who you got gathered around your table says something about who you are. It says something about what you care about. And so I want to invite you to open up your Bibles to a scene where Jesus comes to dinner. And he tells a rather pointed parable about how to act when you come to dinner or when you have a dinner party. It's found in the Gospel according to Luke chapter 14, verse 1, and continuing at verses 7 through 14. So let us stand in honor of God's word and together hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. And when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have also been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. And then, humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. And then you will be honored in the place of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, or your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. I wonder, when was the last time you experienced true hospitality? When someone, received you from the heart, created the space for you to be you, the real you. This past April, my family boarded a plane and we headed out to Northern Ireland. Jill and I lived in this little seaside village called Groomsport back in 2005, 2006. I began my first full-time ministry position in Groomsport Presbyterian Church as an assistant minister there. You'll have to forgive the Red Sox hat. I married a New Englander. I was still trying to get in good with the family. And so we went back, mostly because we wanted to share with our kids a place that had become part of our story. And just as importantly, we wanted to share with them some people who taught us what it means to welcome others in. I was fresh out of seminary when we moved, which means I was almost completely useless. And I had a little bit of book knowledge. I'd read quite a bit about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, this fighting that had been going on for centuries between Protestants and Catholics, and it torn the country apart. And so I had this funny idea that I was going to go and I was going to change the way these people thought about the gospel and what it meant to welcome the other. Little did I know that they would change the way that I experienced the welcome of God by the way they just brought us in. Now, this is not to say that it was all smooth sailing. My senior colleague let me learn the hard way that if you wear the certain type of clerical collar that we Presbyterians wore in that culture, and you went into a certain side of town, you would be met with a certain type of hostility. And so, this one time when I was out, I went to do my rounds at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and I got there a little bit early, so I decided I'd park my car and I'd walk a way in. And so I grabbed my camera, went in to do my rounds, and then on the way back, as I'm going back to my car, I decided I'm going to take a little detour down one of these side streets so I can catch a glimpse of some of these cool murals that they have out there. And, after a couple of turns in there, I start to realize as people start looking at me more strangely, like maybe I am not where I am supposed to be right now. And just as I'm having this thought, I hear this whizzing sound by me, and I see this glass break on the wall next to me. And then these two little kids, they could not have been much more than 10 years old, wheel up in their bicycles, and they take one look at me and say, "Hey, mister, you Protestant or are you Catholic?" And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what the right answer is. And so I just say, I'm from California. And they say, "Oh, great, do you know any movie stars?" I'm like, "Yes, because that's what we do in California." So there was some hostility mixed in with the hospitality, but the overwhelming experience we had was of being welcomed in. And when we went back this spring, we had been away from 11 years, from Groomsport for 11 years. But when we stepped back into the fellowship hall of this little church, it was like no time passed whatsoever. We were just gathered around a table, and once again, we were part of the family. Billy and Margaret McCready, who we shared so many meals with, hadn't changed a bit. And as we sat with them over tea and biscuits, it reminded us of all of those Sundays when we gathered together in their house and sat around the table. And those conversations, those days that just kind of stretched into the evening. Those times when nobody was in a rush to do anything except just be present with each other. As we've been describing this series on hospitality, there's always a piece of my heart that gets drawn back into those unassuming homes in County Down, into this place where these hosts created a space for us to be who we were, and maybe even to change who we would become. We wanted to share that with our kids because when you experience a kind of welcome like that, you realize what a rare gift that it is. Hospitality creates a space to share with others the best of what you've got and the best of who you are, and it allows other people to do the same, which is why in this morning's scripture passage, Jesus is awfully concerned about who it is that gets invited to the table. Who's at the table says something about what you value, who you value. As Luke Powery says, the table is not only the place where one says grace, it is the place where one may extend grace. Throughout our history, tables have been places where great ideas are exchanged. Some of you may remember from Philosophy 101 that great exploration of love known as Plato's Symposium. Basically, it just took place at this wine-drenched dinner party. But tables have also always been the place historically where we draw boundaries about who is in and who is out. I mean, after all, who has not gone through that agonizing process of trying to figure out at a wedding reception where to stick that strange uncle? And if you don't know, you're probably that strange uncle. The truth is, who you practice hospitality with, it says something about you. Jesus is interested in what happens around the table, so much so that it can appear to the casual reader as you go through Luke's gospel, it looks like all he does is eat. So here's just a glimpse of what Luke records in his gospel. Jesus eats dinner at Levi's house. He eats at Simon's house. He eats at Mary and Martha's house. He eats at the home of a Pharisee. He eats at the home of this Pharisee, Zacchaeus. He institutes the Last Supper at a table. He breaks bread at Emmaus and reveals himself. He promises the Holy Spirit. And then there is this boundary-breaking nature of the church shown when Jews and Gentiles break the bread together. In fact, Jesus has got such a rep for gathering around the table that he gets in a little bit of trouble for it. First, because he's a bit of a foodie, I think. think it's pretty fair to say that Jesus would dig this whole food truck culture we got going on here in the OC. In Luke 7:34, Jesus echoes a little bit of the criticism that is directed toward him when he says, "The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard.'" But the thing is, Jesus does not just get in trouble because he eats and drinks. He gets in trouble because of who he does his eating and his drinking with. To finish out that verse, Jesus notes, "You say, 'Look, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'" Now, if you go to any junior high cafeteria in America, you see pretty quickly that who you eat with is an act of identification. And this new rabbi's propensity to show up and to spend time with the outcasts, with those on the fringes of society, it raised more than a few suspicions of the religious elite. But this habit of eating with outcasts, it must have gotten ingrained in his disciples too, because that same curious brow is furrowed at Peter when he goes to the house of the Gentile Cornelius and he's asked the question, "Why did you go to these uncircumcised men and eat with them?" Who you got around your table tells a story. And that story says something about who you value and what you value. And that's what gets interesting about this setting. Jesus looks around at this table and he sees the guests climbing all over each other for status and for position. And while he never turns down an invitation to eat, Jesus has not just come to have dinner. He has come to reveal the upside-down nature of the gospel, of this kingdom where table manners look a little bit different. And so he just drops some practical wisdom on his guests. He says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit in a place of honor. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place. In other words, don't crowd your host with your resume, with your accomplishments, but think soberly of yourself. And do that so the host can lift you up. Because in the logic of the kingdom, if you humble yourself, you will be exalted. But if you exalt yourself... Now, this story about hospitality involves humility, the humility of the guests. But needless to say, humility is not a virtue that is particularly in vogue in our cultural moment. We are taught from the cradle to celebrate ourselves, to project strength, to minimize weakness, to tell the whole world that we've got our act together. And so we go and we post on social media pictures of all the rad things that we do, as though this is every moment of our life. Because heaven forbid someone should find out that we are not always doing something awesome. Or we are not the sum of our best thoughts about ourselves. And so we're taught to kind of advance ourselves by pushing other people aside. I mean, in this particular political climate, when was the last time you heard someone say, "You know, my opponent actually makes a number of good points"? And no one in the history of ever has begun a college admission essay with, "I'm probably not the best and brightest in my class." I mean, by the time that students apply to school now, they've already sold a couple of algorithms to tech companies, they've written grants to found a nonprofit, and they have mastered obscure sports like mountain unicycling. It's a thing, people. Mountain unicycling. In fact, I got an email a couple of weeks ago from one of my former students, this kid who's just effortlessly brilliant. He finished his second year up at Princeton University as a molecular biology pre-med / comparative lit major. And so I asked him, what are you doing for fun this summer? For fun kind of being the operative phrase in that. And this is what he said, I kid you not. He said, not much. I'm just working this pediatric surgery internship in France, and I'm writing an article on Turgenev's romantic idealist period for this literary magazine that I edit. Oh, and I'm training for a marathon. What are you up to, Stephen? Man, what am I up to? So I wanted to write back, I am actually trying to relentlessly eliminate hurry from my life. But we're brought up in this kind of achievement culture where we're constantly told that we got to market ourselves, and we've grown to have tremendous faith in ourselves. So humility is just something that's not on the menu. In his book, The Road to Character, New York Times columnist David Brooks notes this 1950s Gallup poll in which a number of high school students are asked the question, are you a very important person? And at that point, in 1950, 12% said, yes, I am a very important person. A similar poll was conducted in 2005. Do you want to guess the percentage? 80%. 80% said, yes, I am a very important person. So we've got a lot of self-confidence. Brooks cited this other study that was conducted at UCLA in which researchers asked a number of junior high students, would you rather be the president of Harvard University or would you rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant? By a ratio of 3 to 1, they would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Although, to be fair, Brooks says he asked the president of Harvard and she too would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. That's where we are. We're in this culture of people striving to win and earn success because we've come to believe that in order for us to matter, we have got to get that seat at the head of the table. We all know what it's like to be baptized into the cultural waters of self-glorification. And we all face the temptation to look flawless, but we all know that we're not. And it's just this game that somehow we have agreed to play. Constantly spinning our weaknesses into strengths. Because the rules of social mobility dictate that we got to show to anyone and everyone that we are at the top of our game at any given moment. But then Jesus shows up to the dinner party. And he just kind of flips the scorecard. He says the kingdom is actually not a race to the top, friends. It is a race to the bottom. And as if to underscore the nature of the situation in which he finds himself, he then turns his table on the host. He says, you gotta look elsewhere as well, friend. When you give a wedding feast, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, because all those people can pay you back. Instead, when you have a party, invite the poor, invite the crippled, invite the lame. And you're going to be blessed precisely because they cannot pay you back. And so this table that Jesus is building, it does not include the usual suspects. Instead, he issues an invitation to those who can't return a thing for our hospitality. Those who are not upwardly mobile. Those who cannot help us leverage our way to a bigger and a better seat. Now, Jesus' hospitality is the kind where those on the margins are brought front and center and given a seat at the head of the table, where the ones who are on the fringes become friends. Incidentally, a couple weeks ago, when Brian was preaching, he talked about how Paul encourages the Roman church to practice hospitality. And the word that he uses for practice hospitality in chapter 12, verse 13 is the word philoxenian, which is this strange sandwiching of two completely opposite words. Philos, which is kind of the affectionate mutuality between friends, and then xenos, which means stranger, alien, foreigner, basically the one with whom you have nothing in common. And he just throws those two words together and says that is hospitality. And so maybe one thing for us to think about is that hospitality is this practice of allowing strangers to become friends. Suddenly, when you have that in mind, you read the gospel a little bit differently. And you see how all throughout Jesus is gathering together with these outsiders. And what he's doing is he's just acting out this parable of the final kingdom feast of the Lamb. When God gathers all people together. Because in Jesus, hospitality is always free. There's nothing to pay him back with. There's no way to do it. And you don't need to bring anything because the feast is already set. There's no amount of posturing that can get a seat at this table. But it turns out that the only ones that are even going to show up are the ones who know that they don't have a chance of getting in otherwise. They're just grateful to be invited. So have you ever thought about the way that hospitality and gratitude are connected? Archbishop of Canterbury, the former Archbishop, Michael Ramsey, says that thankfulness is a soil in which pride does not easily grow. Friends, that's the kind of hospitality Jesus has in mind. And it hinges on this recognition that it is a gift of pure grace just to be invited. And so for us, hospitality requires the humility to create space for the other. And this humility ought to come naturally because all of us who are here know that we don't deserve the invitation we've been given. Andre Nouwen writes that the point of offering hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them a space where change can take place. And that is exactly what Jesus does when he invites us to his table. He takes us in while we were enemies and strangers and somehow calls us friends. I imagine that seems like a really bizarre, strange move to the host. But that's exactly what hospitality is, welcoming the stranger, welcoming the one who is not like me. And in the logic of the kingdom, welcoming the stranger not only makes for a better table, but it also shows us how our humility is concretely lived out. Because Jesus' hospitality requires the humility not to hold your social standing, your reputation, or even your conceived sense of propriety too closely. It explodes this tendency we have for self-advancement, and it casts this vision of the church where we can toss reputation to the wind, not because reputation doesn't matter, but because in the end, we are known better than we know ourselves by the one who gives us an invitation to the only table that matters. Last week, here at St. Andrews, we hosted our friends and ministry partners from Teen Challenge on Super Saturday. Many of you were here for that. I said it many times, but it's one of my favorite things that we do here. Not just because it's a ton of fun and it's something that my kids love coming to, but because for a couple of hours, Deerenville Hall gets transformed into a family room. And there's games and there's conversation, but amidst all of that, there is a lot of laughter. It's this time when we invite these men who are in this really intense season of their lives. Oftentimes they've been shut out from their circles of friends and they've been cut off from their families, and they find themselves welcomed to a new family table. And they've all come, kind of allowing God to do the hard work of tilling up the soil in their hearts so that he can plant something new. And I got to tell you, time and time again, what I find springing out of that seed that God has planted is something incredibly grateful. And these guys know that they can't repay back the guys who have walked alongside them, at least not in the way of professional or social advancement, but on so many occasions, the joy of these guys that I've spoken with, it reminds me of this grace and mercy so profound, and yet how profoundly I take it for granted. So as I was watching from a distance last week, standing on the edge of the room, I could not help but notice, and I couldn't help but think about this parable that Jesus tells. A table where all strangers, each one in need of grace, come as guests invited. And that's really what's at the heart of this season in the life of our church, creating a space to belong. It's not about the campus improvements we've made. It's about setting the table for everyone in need of the grace that we find here. It's about expanding the communion table not only to include the remembrance of what Jesus has done, but to point toward all those times of communion that take place around a meal or around a cup of coffee or around a game of apples to apples or presidents or whatever you want. It's about inviting people to come and be with. And it's about becoming a community of thankful guests who know that but for the grace of God, none of us would have a seat. Hospitality begins when we create a space for strangers to become friends. When we offer the best of ourselves and allow God to do the work of transformation that only He can do. And so the gospel asks us this question this morning. Do we have the humility to look beyond our own preferred guest list? Can we stop worrying about what it's going to take to get ahead long enough to recognize that Jesus' table is not about accomplishment, but about gratitude? Who you got around the table tells a story. For those who have been given so much, maybe it's time to build a longer table